La primera sesión del día de hoy está denominada ¿Pueden medirse el crimen organizado y la respuesta del Estado? Y cuenta con la moderación de la señora Ángela Me, de la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito. Le otorgamos el uso de la voz a la señora Me.
And good morning to everyone. So we start the day with an interesting conversation with Mark Shaw on measuring organized crime. And Mark is the director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Is an initiative where, is an institution where they do research, so research on organized crime, but also there are operational aspects, and so it's a nice combination of, if you want, knowledge and also what do we do when we have knowledge. He was previously the National Research Foundation Professor of Justice and Security at the University of Cape Town, where he's now an adjunct professor, and is actually a former colleague from UNODC. So I think what Mark is bringing into this conversation is really a mix of experience from research, but also operation, because in UNODC also he led a lot of field operations. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Angela and colleagues for the very kind invitation to speak. And to Peruvian colleagues, thank you very much for the hospitality. And I should congratulate you on making the World Cup, something that sadly South Africa didn't manage to achieve. So congratulations to Peruvian colleagues. I'm really honored to participate in this meeting, and for me it's really an important meeting to get people to talk together around issues of crime statistics and other related aspects. Just to say, the Global Initiative was formed in 2013 by a group of senior law enforcement officials, including the current head of Interpol, for example, who felt that there was a divide between those working on issues of governance and development and those working directly on law enforcement responses to organized crime. And the initiative is an attempt to bridge that divide. And at its heart, the work of the GI is based on the assumption that a more coherent and preventative response to organized crime can only be achieved if a diversity of actors, both within and outside of government, work more effectively together, including in sharing data and analysis. And so to this end, the GI has been engaged in a range of analytical work, supporting media in the field, independent media and civil society around the world. We have published more than 80 reports in the last 5 years, engaged in extensive policy consultations, many of them off the record, in a range of different contexts. We chair a dialogue between major development agencies. We engage extensively with the private sector. And we are engaged in a series of catalytic pilot projects. I'll mention one or two in my presentation, including several that look at how to gather new forms of data about organized crime. And so currently the initiative has about 30 full-time staff and a head office in Geneva. And one of the issues that we have been struggling with is that of measuring organized crime and government responses to it. And to be published in 2019, we have been working on a global tool, aptly named the Organized Crime Assessment, or OCA, which will provide a multidimensional measure of states' relationships to organized crime through 3 sub-indices. And I won't go through them in any detail, but state vulnerability, criminal markets, and state resilience. So a measure of 3 dimensions which we think are important in the context of constructing a measure of organized crime. And our hope is that the OCA can serve as the conceptual framework by which states can understand their overall relationship to organized crime threats. And in the absence of a review mechanism, I'm not sure how many of you followed the debate in Vienna around the review mechanism for the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, a mechanism to quantify states' vulnerability and responses to illicit markets seems not only to fill an important void, but may catalyze further thinking around institutional responses. So it's crucial in the years ahead, in my view, that we are able to measure organized crime more effectively. And political prioritization and policy making is often only spurred by a sense of how big a problem is. And presently, I would argue, our ability to provide that information on illicit markets and organized crime is highly limited. And while there's much excellent work going on in government, in academia, in civil society, like the GI, we are faced with the enormous complexity of measuring a hidden set of activities around the illicit economy and associated organized crime. Estimates compete. The organized crime analytical and scholarly community, if you like, does not always speak with one voice, not that they should, but unlike terrorism, there's rarely a catalytic event that can invoke strong reaction from citizens or spur states to action. So in most places, organized crime, I think you could say, is a kind of slow burner on the policy agenda. It is a slow and insidious march of particular forms of economic activity or illicit economic activity or criminal governance. And as Peter very eloquently outlined yesterday in his presentation, the field is plagued with definitional, conceptual and methodological challenges combined with the reality that there are multiple illicit economies shaped by different local, national and regional contexts, and often in the context of insecurity. Crimes are attritional and their negative impacts broadly spread amongst different stakeholders in the community, in society and along transnational supply chains. And so again, to emphasize, for this reason, we urgently need, in my view, a better means to measure organized crime, which must be nuanced enough to capture the fact that organized crime and its impact may look different and does look different in different places. And to do that, we need to understand existing data, including on illicit economic and social activities, and how that data may act as proxies, if you like, for measuring the nature and scale of criminal activities. But we also need to create new sets of data, and I want to mention some possibilities around that in my presentation this morning. But I also want to suggest in the presentation that it's not enough just to measure crime, but we must also work out how to capture states' responses and their efficacy in a more systematic way. In my own experience in working in many countries, I think you can say that states are always part of the criminal economy, shaping it, regulating it, participating in it. And so understanding states as a context or as an actor is very important. And for some time it's been understood that the most common measure of illicit markets or organized crime generated by states, for example seizure data, is actually very poor or serves as a very poor indicator of illicit flows and certainly of organized crime. So seizures do not represent a random sample of illicit transactions. Instead, they represent, if you like, a dysfunctional, or they represent the dysfunctional or less efficient part of the illicit trade or a illicit trade where flows have been intercepted. And the presence of reported seizures tells us significantly more about law enforcement and reporting than they do about the flows themselves. Now that's not new and has been widely stated by others. And evidence from several countries where we are working at the moment also suggests the depressing regularity in which what is seized disappears from state control and is recycled back into the illicit economy. We hardly ever measure that, but it is relatively common in some places. So we therefore need to begin to distinguish our measure of flows from those of responses and learn to analyze how the two are interrelated. And as the conference highlights, work is already underway in multiple studies and research projects, particularly on the measurement of crime, but significantly less on the measurement and analysis of state responses. So we need to expand those lessons and include data identification and collection, in particular as part of a range of government processes. And I want to suggest some ideas around that. And I think we need to build a more coherent intellectual framework where data is comparable, cohesive, and measured over and can be measured over time. And that's a huge challenge in this particular sector. So I want to divide my presentation into three broad themes. The first is, and it sounds that the answer to this is obvious, but I want to suggest that it's not. The first is, why do we need to measure organized crime and illicit markets at all? The second is, how practically and methodologically may we go about doing this. And the third part of the presentation, I want to turn to some issues and lessons around measuring state responses. So I'll deal with each of those three themes in turn. Turning to the issue of why, as I've said, the discussion around why we should measure organized crime and state responses seems obvious. We need to find more effective ways to measure the phenomena, as we do in the case of health or education, so that we can find better ways of improving government-style forms of delivery. But I would like to posit that we need effective and multiple measures of organized crime or illicit markets where organized crime is active, so that precisely because organized crime and illicit trafficking have become established global phenomena affecting all states, including its places of source, transit, or destination, or all three combined. But the debate on the extent of criminal markets remains fragmented, and it's often conducted in a series of silos, say by those concerned with trafficking in human beings, or those concerned with drug markets, or those concerned with the environment. And there's good reason, I think, to seek to build a more effective common language around these discussions, which serves to cross-cut some of the challenges or the conceptual challenges around each of measuring the markets. So issues of terminology and the extent of the phenomena itself remain unclear. And we are talking really about an enormous diversity of criminal activity. And on our own work, particularly in Africa, the turn of the millennia, when the global economy saw an important spurt, also saw the growth of a number or a diversity of illicit markets. Now, I want to illustrate this. Can we go as one slide back? I want to illustrate this by showing a slide of Security Council resolutions that mention the issue of organized crime or illicit trafficking. Now, you can argue that the Security Council, whatever its weaknesses, stands at the apex of global governance. Its remit is to adjudicate and to respond in situations most pressing for global security. And nothing in my presentation is about whether or not the Security Council represents fully all countries, etc. What I want to suggest is the degree to which organized crime has become a core or key policy issue at the global level. And what the graph suggests is the dramatic increase in mentions of illicit markets or organized crime since the year 2000, and a growth in the diversity of criminal markets recorded in resolutions. Again, Peter made mention of this point, but I think the graph highlights it in a really fundamental way. In 2015, remarkable, more than 60% of all resolutions at the Security Council mentioned illicit markets or some form of organized crime and their linkage to conflict. Now, I joined the UN in 2001. My first boss, Jan van Dijk, is in the audience. Organized crime was barely on the agenda of the Security Council. How that has changed over just over a decade. And over the same time period, just over 60% of those mentions. And okay, this is a slightly biased point because the Security Council is dealing with conflict and many conflicts are in Africa, but 60% of those mentions relate to Africa, a continent that previously was not seen to suffer from an organized crime problem. In fact, the term organized crime was not used widely in the African continent until recently. And so what we are talking about on the slide is this incredible diversity of crimes under discussion, from arms trafficking to wildlife and natural resource trafficking, to piracy, to human trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, cybercrime, drug use and drug trafficking. And we captured and recorded 12 forms of organized crime over the period, and as you can see on the graph, those numbers have this year-on-year growth over the period. And I think this is seen, and it highlights the degree to which organized crime is seen. I'm not suggesting that this is a measure of whether or not organized crime is increasing. I'm saying that it's the degree to which organized crime is seen as posing a significant threat to peace and security, and both at the national and international level. And I think you can argue in multiple forms it is seen as providing a spoiler for sustainable development, including in the areas of public health, economic stability and governance. And in an increasingly globalized world, organized crime has arguably transcended borders, touching communities, local communities, at every corner of the globe. And perhaps more than people realize, next slide please, organized crime plays a prominent role in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this serves as an overarching framework, as has been mentioned by other speakers. Importantly, it's a framework around which there's strong global agreement. And the focus is really on the organized crime discussion, as Angela knows very well, has been around SDG 16, on the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies. And it's explicitly seen as the goal around which the measurement of organized crime in a variety of manifestations should be conducted. Yet if you look at the wider agenda of the SDGs, you can see that organized crime affects almost all of them. So as illustrated in our slide, our analysis suggests that some 23 targets in the SDG framework require a direct response to organized crime or illicit markets. For example, responding to forms of human trafficking or labor exploitation. In 4 cases, I think you can argue illicit markets, organized crime groups, networks that operate within them have a real impact. So the environment and the global biodiversity goals are at risk from poaching and trafficking in environmental commodities. In health, where drug trafficking exacerbates the threats of communicable diseases and places undue burdens on public health systems, and counterfeit medicines erodes people's trust in health institutions. I think the important point, and many people in the room have been involved in this debate for a very long time, these 2 global frameworks in many ways are unprecedented. They set the framework for placing a great deal more importance on the issue of illicit markets and associated organized crime, and has begun in a way to prioritize these 2 issues in a way that was never the case in the past. And I think that reflects strongly on the question of why we need to measure organized crime and its impacts more effectively. And it also highlights that much of the attention on organized crime and the debate has shifted from the global north to the global south. And this applies particularly, as I've tried to suggest, by the linkage between at least perceptions of criminal complicity or engagement around conflict, and particularly in Africa. And indeed, there's important evidence that crime and violence are considerably worse in the global south. The UNODC's own homicide report of 2013, for example, suggesting that the overall global homicide rate may be decreasing, but that rates of violence, particularly those associated with illicit markets or organized crime, are increasing or at least are not improving in the global south. And that applies also to the city where I am from. And this convergence on the discussion between conflict, development, and crime, I want to suggest, is not a politically neutral space. In fact, it is highly contested. And there remains real disagreements around cause and effect. And while the debate on conflict and development issues have long-standing track records and scholarly communities, the same is not necessarily the case, in my view, at least for organized crime. And for example, criminology discussions as they connect to international development and conflict issues remain underdeveloped. And there are several reasons for this. One is the lack of data, as I have explained. The second is that there are not enough people in the global south, I would argue, working on the relevant issues. And that's true of both state and non-state institutions, so both academic and civil society actors. So I want to make the argument around why we measure organized crime and illicit trafficking by suggesting that there are a wider set of debates, I've mentioned those on development and conflict, that need to be more effectively bridged. And that doing so will require better data, better analysis, and the inclusion of Southern perspectives. And this will be an essential requirement to bring balance to a discussion about how to avoid a likely securitization of development as we move forward. The why, then, is not just about using data to catalyze what you might term as political prioritization and to provide an evidence base for law enforcement responses. It is about achieving a more balanced approach beyond just a focus on criminal justice responses, with wider and more critical perspectives on an issue of concern for the global community as a whole. So in my view, then, measurement is not only a way to highlight the scale of the problem, but to highlight the diversity of responses required. In other words, what data we collect and use will be crucial to how we shape responses and who will be involved in doing so. And I think that's the critical issue around why we need to measure, but we need to measure within a particular framework and conceptual understanding. If I can turn to my second theme, how do we go about doing at a practical or at a conceptual level should this work be done? Now, in a previous life, Angela didn't mention it, but there are South African colleagues in the room as well. And I must say it's very, very good to see such a strong South African delegation here today and working on crime statistics. And it's releasing crime statistics in South Africa is not for the faint-hearted, given the degree of political discussion and debate around the issue. But in a previous life, I was a government official responsible for an analytical unit in what was then called the Ministry of Safety and Security in the first days of the new democracy. And we launched a process around an organized crime threat assessment. And this drew on comparative experience and advice. And we attempted to marry data on both organized crime groups and networks, including data collected from intelligence in the field and the collection of quantitative information around the evolution of various criminal markets in the country. And information in both cases was lacking and often difficult to bring together. The state security agencies had been focused on political issues and not on criminal issues to some degree. So information on organized crime was weak. And there wasn't a very good understanding of which and how criminal networks were involved in illicit markets. And I think you could judge 20, 25 years afterwards, you could probably judge our efforts to be a failure. And primarily, in my view, it's because they did not lead to a more strategic and proactive response to organized crime. And I think that mirrors the outcome of multiple organized crime threat assessments that have been conducted in both developed and developing countries in the 20 years since our own effort in South Africa. And you can read the public versions of several of these online, including from Interpol and Europol, and the GI itself has been involved in several assessments, both in Africa and elsewhere. And I think the failure of the threat assessment concept, if you like, to catalyze better responses can be attributed to several reasons. Firstly, they are written almost exclusively by police or security analysts, and usually for the same audience. They describe threats in tactical terms, numbers of seizures, groups, flows, points of entry. Some of the stronger assessments might think forwards about emerging trends or future risks, but the balance between blue sky thinking and security planning are often poorly made. And threat assessments, in part because of their authors, often fail to contextualize crime trends within a broader political economy or social agenda, and which means that they often don't resonate very well with those setting political priorities. They are seldom discussed in whole-of-government forums that would trigger responses from a broader set of stakeholders, the development community, civil society, the private sector, for example, and they often remain a tool by the police and for the police. And assessments are often written, Michael mentioned this in his presentation, or alluded to it. Assessments are often written in the context of the struggle for budgetary allocations, even within policing departments, or sometimes with a particular agenda to overemphasize or underemphasize some particular threats. So I think a crucial flaw is that it's almost impossible to measure progress based on year-on-year organized crime threat assessments that have been conducted in many governments. With the growing need to justify the use of citizens' tax monies, achieving visible results, understanding how interventions have impacted trends over time have become, of course, much more important for policymakers in most states. But periodic threat assessments done in each case to capture the threat landscape of the time often fail to highlight successes or to describe, if you like, the narrative of organized crime's evolution. And the first consequence of this is that measuring organized crime is oddly often delinked from attempts to actually do something about it. And that's reflected in a divide between the operational and analytical in many institutions of government. And indeed, one of the biggest divides remains to align a culture of investigation and prosecution, the pursuing of individual cases, as well as that of intelligence collection, with a wider understanding of the dynamics and changes in illicit markets themselves, and moving towards a more proactive and preventative approach which focuses on reducing vulnerabilities. So what do we do? How do we capture the invisible and often intangible way that builds then a broader set of responses, as I've tried to highlight in my first section on why we should do this work? As I mentioned in the opening, many turn to seizure data, and I don't want to overly criticize the issue of seizure data, but it is still widely used in countries around the world. And while perhaps sometimes useful, seizure and criminal justice statistics provide little, if any, insight into criminal markets and their evolution. Seizures themselves are an intervention in the trafficking process, as Jonathan mentioned yesterday in his presentation, a measure of a state response. And law enforcement action resulting in a series of illegal goods may lead traffickers to change their storage locations, networks, trade routes, and methods of concealment and transportation. And countries also differ greatly in their abilities to make and report on seizures, but the data makes them look comparable. This ends up putting forth, in my view, at least a biased or skewed view, and one that provides limited scope for assessing or determining future trends. And most importantly, perhaps, quite apart from putting measures of what is seized out there, in terms of responses, I think you can argue that you get what you measure. And if the metric established for success in the fight against organized crime or the reduction or control of illicit markets is the quantity or frequency of seizures, then the result will be a greater emphasis and investment in the law enforcement agencies that interdict and disrupt. So state-generated seizure data is, of course, only one example where we face challenges of incompleteness. And what I want to say or to emphasize is that what we require in the years ahead is a concerted effort to build a more effective and consistent system of data collection on multiple places and on multiple issues until we have better regional or global coverage. Now, I'm not naively saying that this can simply be decreed. In fact, what we are talking about is an incremental process of gathering data over time. And many other cross-cutting debates have been in a similar position, the human rights discussion being one. And where the ability to collect data has improved greatly. And much of that work was led by civil society and academia and other groups outside of government. And I think the same will apply in this particular debate too. That's not to say that there has been no innovation, quite the contrary. Only to say that we have not reached the point in the vast majority of states where data collection is systematic, and much local intervention is required, including from statistical agencies in the collection of data and the more effective use of government intelligence systems in market data collection. And I want to provide 4 examples, which I've summarized on the slide, around where I think data should be collected. And I'll go through them briefly, but it resonates a little bit with the point Peter made in his closing point around issues of harm and violence and what are some of the defining features around organized crime. But let me go through these briefly. The first is the collection of data of price on illicit commodity. And that remains one of the most important mechanisms to monitor criminal markets. And I don't have to tell people in the room, particularly in Latin America, UNODC has long collected price data on drug use and trafficking through surveys and country submissions of annual questionnaires. And much has been learned in the process of monitoring drug markets, and much more work is required to extend that work elsewhere. Yet few governments systematically collect information on prices on other illicit markets. The second area that I think is worth collecting new data on is what I will call protection payments. And I think that's crucial. In almost every criminal market, there are established and agreed upon systems of payment that protect the flow of illegal commodities. So we have a large-scale project with some 30 monitors in the Sahel and Libya, collecting prices that migrants pay for protection from militia groups. And those prices are relatively standardized, and they are key to understanding that criminal market. And such payments exist in multiple forms in most criminal markets, including from those that include systematic extortion to higher level forms of political protection. And I think it's absolutely possible to collect such data if resources and efforts are brought to bear. And we have engaged in a preliminary study of police protection payments in East Africa, for example, in East African coastal drug markets. And they provide a remarkable picture of the degree to which markets have consolidated and symbiotic relations have developed with state actors. And I want to suggest too that social surveys, or the inclusion in victim surveys of issues around what might be termed crime governance, literally rule by criminal groups, and trust of the police and state institutions, are also critical contributors to our understanding here of local protection and issues that drive fear and violence. The third area, as mentioned on the slide, that I feel is really important to collect data on is the links between violence and organized crime. Data on targeted killings between criminal groups and networks, for example, I think is a unique resource. And while such data is often complex to interpret, no deaths in a criminal market may mean a higher degree of consolidation, for example, many criminal markets in the developing world remain highly fragmented and internally competitive. So data on hits ordered by criminal groups is seldom separated or disaggregated from overall homicide data, and often ignored by the police as internal fights between criminal groups or networks, rather than a source of data useful in the measurement of organized crime. And we have been collecting data on criminal assassinations in several countries, notably in South Africa. So we have a very big database of 1,400 incidents. And I think that's given us new perspective on where the harm within the criminal market comes. And it's not necessarily from where most people think it does. And so that means a reorientation, in my view, around a particular criminal market, which is not widely understood to have strong mafia control, but yet generates enormous amounts of criminal assassinations. And finally, the fourth point, the collection of data on the harm or the impact caused by crime is crucial. And impact is exceedingly difficult concepts to define, as is harm, and I won't go into it now, only to make the point. But the same conditions which may put states at risk to organized crime may also be the result of the impact of these activities. So conflict, remembering the Security Council resolutions, may fuel state instability, which in turn allows criminal networks to carry out their activities in a localized or in a wider zone. And on the other hand, the use of violence and the exploitation of economic and social, through the exploitation of economic and social inequalities, organized crime itself can lead to conflict. And in my view, at least, government and law enforcement activity should, by definition, bring changes to these price structures and to the nature of criminal economies and the harm they cause, including the violence that they generate. And yet intelligence systems are generally not tasked to collect such data, nor statistics or development agencies analyze it. And understanding these numbers over time is crucial to effectively understanding change in criminal markets and also understanding their impact. And importantly too, these kinds of metrics, harm, price, violence, are much more linked to the priorities of policymakers and citizens themselves, who are rarely interested in responding to organized crime for its own sake. But they are seeking to reduce levels of criminal governance and violence in the communities in which they live, to strengthen the integrity of local and national social and political institutions, economies and financial systems, to protect the environment and to preserve natural resources. So it's also important to remember then, and that's drawing to the conclusion on my second theme, that notwithstanding the already enormous challenges of measuring organized crime, there are equal challenges to measuring state responses. And that's the third and final part of the presentation that I want to make this morning. One of the principles of the tool, the OCA tool, which I mentioned earlier, is that the reality is that not all states are equal in their vulnerability to illicit markets and organized crime. And I think this is a key point. Not all states are equal in their vulnerability. And in what we have termed the vulnerability component, if you remember these three triangles, the vulnerability component of the index starts with a foundational analysis on some of the systemic, socio-political, demographic, resource, economy, globalization conditions that make a territory attractive to organized crime. And we are attempting by doing so to recognize that many vulnerability factors may be far beyond an individual state's control. For example, a history of a sanctions-based economy, the presence of lootable natural resources, the positioning of a state with next to a large drug-producing or trafficking economy. But at the same time, there is plenty of things that a state can do to address organized crime and mitigate its impact. and we feel that it's important to measure the progress of state responses, linked also to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, but also to get a better understanding of what works and what doesn't. And in the OCA tool, therefore, we have built what we believe to be an innovative component that draws together several new data sets to assess the quality of state responses and resilience. And while there's by no means consensus, or frankly much that serves as a baseline as to what constitutes an effective state response, we have tried to quantify this based upon what we know and what is written down of best practice. And as you will see from the slide that is on the screen, we have divided our analytical framework into three categories. The first of these, in some ways, is the most interesting and the newest, and that's what we have termed rhetoric. We know, as you do from work in many parts of the world, that the issue of political will in tackling organized crime is often a precondition for action. And what states, and particularly senior political figures, say about what they are going to do about organized crime is important. A strong response to organized crime needs a champion, and political will can, to a certain extent, be evidenced through the statements of elected officials. And so we have accordingly done our initial 100-odd first phase countries. In those countries, we have coded all speeches made by heads of state and a selection of senior government officials when they speak about or make reference to organized crime, including a breakdown of crime type organized annually since 2000. And this fully acknowledges that some of statements around organized crime are a double-edged sword. Rhetoric often masks a lack of implementation or challenges human rights in an age of political populism. But we have nonetheless found it to be an incredibly rich data set. And in our preliminary analysis, it has illustrated how states can be proactive or reactive to organized crime and how they are aligned with each other, with other components of the model, which include legislative, budgetary, and other steps. Our second category relates to policies and laws, the normative and policy architecture that may be put in place to guide and structure responses to organized crime. And we have coded a large variety of international instruments and states' responses and implementation of those. And we've done a great deal of heavy lifting in identifying and assessing countries' legal architecture as it relates to organized crime, reviewing criminal codes, plus crime-specific legislation for provisions relating to the fight against organized crime in general, as well as individual types of crime, assessing those against key criteria in the UN Convention. We have then turned to implementation and recognizing that once laws are in place, they may not be effectively applied. And implementation is, I think, one of the hardest issues to capture in an index, despite our willingness to spend considerable time and effort in the research. So here we have considered a range of issues, including specialized policing units, budget, the role of a range of actors within the area of responding to organized crime. We have tried to capture the demand and victim provision services using proxy data from other sources, and we have tried to use data on state capacity from the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators to provide, if you like, at the bottom, the base of the pyramid, a sense of progress in implementation responding to organized crime. So these three layers of the cake become a measure, if you like, based on available data, plus some new data of state resilience to organized crime. So brought together with the other two indices, the component on vulnerability, which I mentioned briefly, and the presence of illicit markets, which I haven't touched on in a great deal of detail, that is a measure which is using available data filtered through a system of expert review by criminal market, beginning in Africa, and measured longitudinally. We are relatively optimistic that it could serve as an important instrument for policymakers to understand the interrelationships between organized crime, illicit markets, and state responses. And as I said, this will be published in 2019. It's not perfect, but frankly, and that we frankly and humbly recognize, and we welcome efforts to try and improve it. But we feel it's an important start in capturing the multifaceted challenge of organized crime in a way that should trigger a range of different actors to engage and to prompt a different set of responses. So let me draw to a conclusion by returning once again to the question that I was asked to address. Can organized crime and state responses be measured? And I think the answer to that, based on what I've tried to say, is that based on our current state of knowledge, the answer is probably a heavily qualified yes, with an acknowledgement that what we have presently is a highly fragmented and incomplete set of data. That there's an enormous amount of work still required to improve these forms of measurement at local, national, regional, at international level. That work at each of these levels provides assistance to those working at others, and that given the scale of the challenge and the need for a unified response across sectors and as a global community as a whole, the question of accurate measurement and ongoing debates about how to achieve that are a critical contribution to responding to organized crime effectively and in a balanced way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mark, for the very articulated food for thought that really we had. So we wait for a question, but meanwhile, I have one question. You only mentioned once the issue of prevention. There is a lot of knowledge, research, literature on the prevention of interpersonal violence. Very little. And I have to say also, as UNODC, but also in research, there is very little on prevention of organized crime. And there are different elements, and some of the prevention of organized crime is probably similar to the prevention of crime. The development issue, personal and community, etc. But there is an element of the organized crime that is relating to the regulation system. So ultimately, organized crime has a space when there are regulatory systems to overcome, where they can offer a system. And so what kind of information, what kind of research do we need to bring this more to the attention? So every time there is a regulation that is developed and discussed, and regulations are made by society, if I may simplify, to protect the society. If you think the drugs, if you think others, the wildlife, and so on. So we try to regulate the society to protect it. But when regulations are made, there is very little discussion or information on how to prevent that these are misused by organized crime. So how can we improve the research into that kind of issue of prevention that is more related to the system? What kind of information we can collect and research that we can make it to make it more relevant, more visible?
I mean, two points. The first is that the issue of prevention is contained very clearly in the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And frankly, there has been not much work, nor have states emphasized that dimension. And in many ways, civil society and academia to some degree are responsible, I think, for driving forward that discussion on prevention within the framework of the UN Convention. And I mentioned the UN Convention specifically. Peter very articulately outlined yesterday the issues of definition and the like, and all of that is absolutely true. But we have a global convention. We are not going to be able to negotiate another instrument given the complexities around this issue. So we need to be able to use this platform in a more effective way, and that platform highlights the issue of prevention. I don't know if I can answer your question directly, but the one issue that from our membership and the issues that we are dealing with around regulation is to highlight the degree again to which much of what we are talking about in the organized crime space is not only about law enforcement. Of course there's a law enforcement component, but it's often about local government regulation. It's often about the regulation of commodities or mining or related issues, and it's about the effective implementation of those regulations. And I think that is an enormously important research agenda. I think a lot of that research is qualitative, and we don't do enough of it. Interviews on the ground, looking at how institutions change and are shaped by organized crime. A lot of my impression, I have to say, not only from South Africa, but elsewhere where we are working, is the degree to which local government has been distorted and extorted and changed by the power of organized crime. And the degree of penetration into local government, I think, is a critical issue and one of importance.
Okay, so I will try to read the question, and we have only a few minutes. Huh? Yeah. What do you think is the most effective way of measuring impact of the police in reducing the levels of organized crime? This is one. Just I'll give you. I cannot really read this. Then Peter made the point that localities are much more important than national governments. I think you touch upon in defeating organized crime, in addressing organized crime problem. How do you plan to include I have no idea. Apply to local government. I think you just addressed and made that question. And then crime proceeds, money laundering. I didn't see them explicitly mentioned in the framework to measure organized crime. Should they be there? Then state response. I saw a focus on qualitative assessment. This is very important. I think this was more a comment. I think here is a question on how observatories can play a role in developing information on organized crime. So, okay.
I'll try to answer them, not necessarily in the order that they are given. So one of the focus areas we have is to build civil society observatories around the world to report openly about organized crime. And one of the issues that we want to achieve is to shine a light on the problem, to generate a debate in communities about the nature of organized crime and how it can be confronted. And I use the term organized crime. I didn't get buried in the definitional issues, but so observatories to cover issues of markets, criminal networks, and the like. And I think there's a very, very important role to play for civil society here. And that is a role which combines media reporting, drawing that together, presenting that in strategic reports, if you like, a kind of grey literature which highlights the nature of the problem, which partly exposes individuals involved in the problem, but also looks at some of the preventative issues that are involved. On impact, I think one of the challenges that we have had, and I think both nationally but also in the work that I presented, is that individual prosecutions are not always a very good mechanism to show how a state is proceeding against organized crime. They are and they aren't. Prosecutions are hugely symbolic, in my view, to show that the state is cracking down on organized crime, and even that terminology is not correct, but to show that the state is responding to high-profile people widely known to be associated with criminal markets. So I would argue that there is some relevance to measure and monitor issues around prosecution. Where I think some indicators are wrongly drawn upon is numbers of arrests, for example. I don't think provide a very useful overview. I really feel trying to present the 4 or 5 new areas where data should be collected, that it's much more important, for example, in a heavy gang area. So I've worked a lot in the gang areas in Cape Town. Prosecutions are needed there because there are some very hardcore criminal actors. But at the same time, the objective of the state should be to reduce violence. And in fact, one of the things is that the state has been involved in the promotion of violence because the guns from the state have leaked into gang areas. So in a sense, the measure cannot only, the impact measure has to be about improving the space in which people live. And in those communities, that's a reduction in violence. That's the first thing people will tell you. A reduction in violence, a return to ordinary schooling, and those should be the measures also around which policing interventions are made. On On localities, I think I've broadly answered it. On money laundering, I know we're running out of time. I completely take the point. I think it's a whole nother discussion itself. We have done some work around illicit financial flows in other contexts. I think it's a very difficult area, and from an analytical perspective, much more difficult than is often made out in some of the debates around following the money. I won't say more about that. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to, since somebody wrote some question, and I think you cover a bit, is an issue of the state capacity to apply the policy and how to assess this, also the loss of state capacity when you have, again, I think you have touched, and again, I think you touch a bit on this, on how to measure the justice system in a state threatened by organized crime. So, yeah, when you are into that vicious cycle where the justice system.
I mean, just a quick response. The reason we wanted to include political will in the index is, I mean, a lot of work, for example, to use a very prominent example, a lot of work went into training police in Guinea-Bissau. But there was absolutely no political will. So there were all the tools and the police agencies' capacities present, but no political will to use them. And I think this idea to measure capacity for its own sake is not helpful, hence our attempt to try and understand the political framework in which some of these choices are made.